Noodle is a type of character that I consider to be a classic video game character, one I personally find far more appealing than the majority of standard human-type characters that we are subjected to these days. As you can see, he's a snake and seemingly has no real powers of his own to get the job done, but not all characters need to have obvious special abilities to be fun to use. The developers, Sumo Digital, those legends who developed one of my favourite races ever, which is Outrun 2, decided that Noodle didn't need any special abilities because with him being a snake, it provided them with enough natural abilities that a snake possesses to create a fun, playable character. Noodle is able to slither through small holes, swim and breathe underwater, and most importantly in this game, he is able to wrap himself around multiple objects, which grants him the ability to scale a number of surfaces, which are the foundations of this platform game. Personally, I love this in video games. Characters whose actual beings are created around a gameplay mechanic which would otherwise be impossible. The 90s was full of characters like this and I miss that. And this is indeed what Snake Pass is, one of those rare 3D platformers that many of us loved from back in the day, the likes of Mario 64, Banjo and Kazooie, Rayman 2, and Jak and Daxter. Only the first game though, as the rest of them were rubbish. So, as a 3D platformer, there are a number of key elements that I personally feel need to be right in order to create a good game. So let's start with the controls, something that is very unique to Snake Pass. To control Noodle, you need to first get him moving. This is achieved by holding down the right trigger button on the Switch version. This gets Noodle to start moving, but he moves only at a snail's pace by simply holding down this button. To really get him going, you have to move, well, like a snake. This means holding down the button whilst moving the left analog stick left and right to create that unique zigzagging, slithering motion of a snake. I believe you could set up the controls in the options to remove this requirement, but I played the whole game with it and for the most part enjoyed the movement. My only gripes was when it was difficult to build up speed due to the environment and Noodle's painfully slow pace when he wasn't slithering, certainly testing my patience at time. Then we have Noodle's most unique skill, and that was being able to wrap himself around bamboo poles in order to ascend throughout the levels. This at the start can be very tricky to do. This is mostly because in order to ascend in the game, you also have to hold down the A button to lift up Noodle's neck. So, in total, to climb a basic bamboo pole, you have to hold the trigger down to move forwards, hold the A button, lift up his head, then whilst doing this, you have to move the analog sticks around to ensure that Noodle starts to wrap himself around the pole. To further complicate things, to make Noodle grip even tighter to help prevent him from slipping off, you can hold the left trigger, which helps tighten his grip. It was certainly an interesting control scheme, one that works for the most part, but also takes some time to get used to. This control scheme also forms the basis of the difficulty of the game and initially will result in many falls and deaths until you get better and remember the button combinations. This is also where the camera comes in, which, as we know, for all 3D adventures needs to work, and for the most part it does, but there are also many times when it doesn't, and this can be at times, it can result in deaths and plenty of frustrations. I mostly found this an irritant underwater, where the camera doesn't quite sit right on top of Noodle and you end up battling it in order to see where you're going. And don't get me started on the tight environments where the camera can be a real nightmare. To assist Noodle even further is his little bird friend, Doodle the hummingbird, who I initially thought was an unladen swallow.
What do you mean? An African or European swallow? Huh? I don't know that.
Doodle's main reason for existing is to move the plot along, as he's the only one that speaks, and also he assists Noodle by picking up his tail, helping, and I say that with quotations, helping Noodle around the tricky platforming sections, trying to prevent him from falling. Now then, from launch and up until now, I've seen Snake pass through a number of updates, most of which iron out the frame rate of the game. Today it runs, as smooth as silk for the most part, but at launch the frame rate could be a little choppy, but it would never hinder gameplay, so I wasn't entirely bothered by it. But Doodle, Crom, I hated him initially. You'd have to press a button to whistle, and he'd pick up your tail, but sometimes he wouldn't respond, and it would be at the times when you most needed him. I lost count of the amount of times I plummeted to my death thanks to Doodle's lack of response, but also due to Noodle. Doodle and Noodle, these names, right? Who seemed incapable of clinging to anything. Something that drove me up the wall throughout most of the game, especially the later levels which had rotating platforms. Nightmare material, I'm telling you. This leads onto the levels themselves. Overall, I found the areas in the game to be okay, but nothing really memorable. Aesthetically and graphically, the game looks lovely. Bright, vibrant colors, lots of little details with insects flying around and leaves floating on the wind. All these added a lovely nature-like element to the game, which persists throughout. Accompanying the levels is the soundtrack from the legend that is David Wise. Famed for his Donkey Kong soundtracks amongst many other classic games, and you certainly get a DK vibe from the soundtrack in this game. There are 4 worlds in the game in total, each with 5 levels that slowly scale in difficulty. Scale? Get it? Because he's a snake? Never mind. I didn't find the levels boring, but I also found them not very memorable, as mentioned before. Then there are the odd few ball puzzles that have you trying to push a rolling ball into a hole, which proves to be a nightmare as a snake, especially underwater. So I didn't enjoy any of those. One last thing I'd like to mention are the tough save points. Be prepared to die a lot and often repeat content, as there is no autosave in this game, only checkpoints. Something I don't have an issue with in games, but in this one, especially with some of the tougher puzzles, dying and having to repeat content because the last checkpoint was a little further back, grinded on me more than once. But overall, I found Snake Pass to be a charming, if what somewhat challenging and frustrating experience. It's not a long game, but it certainly has value for money and is worth a play if you like a unique 3D puzzle platformer. Noodle is animated with great facial expressions, and the game for the most part is fun to play, so I do recommend it. If you'd like a score, then I'd probably give this game a 7 out of 10.